Hi, I'm going to go through a few steps to show how to bring moss into a scene ready for lighting. I may do a few other things while I'm in the scene too, just to show you what I've been doing as part of scene prep. So I have seen day 3B, is that right? 3B, yep. And I'm basically, it's already partially through lighting, and I'm just going to do a few things in here to update some stuff. So first thing I'm going to do is just check all my assets are up to date. Looking down here, I can see that the rock needs to be updated, so it's really easy. All I need to do is go to the latest version, which is version 15, and wait for that to replace. Some of these things, particularly the rock, do take a while, so I will pause it and come back. Okay, so the rock is updated now. And check the sun. Latest version of the sun is version 7, that's correct. Cameras are all version 3s. Just a note, if we were to actually see the sun in any of these shots, you might want to switch to sun_high, because we do have a high-res sun, but since it's not visible, pretty sure, I'll just check. Yeah, it's not actually visible at any point, so it doesn't matter. We can just leave it as is. Wave rig. Let me check what the latest wave rig is. Actually, we're up to version 10 on this one, and we're on wave rig high, so that's good. Just update that one. This is quicker. There we go. All right. Yes. So what we've also brought in here is water that is affected by the boss simulation. So let me just show you that. So if I go to effects, boss, we can see, I don't actually need that one, we can see this one here, which is adding a bit more ripple to things. So we'll see how that goes. We may want to adjust things. If it's too strong, we may want to make this more subtle. So right off the bat, I'm looking at this thing, it looks quite aggressive. I'm going to just say that maybe we drop the wave height to 20. And this is just a deformer that's deforming the wave rig. So it's kind of like an additive thing. So there's already bigger waves moving, and this is just adding a subtle wave. Plus there's also displacement on top of that too. So there's 3 things adding up. And if we were to have the log interacting with the water, we would want to use this wave solver as well. But I think in this scene we don't really need to get into that. We could ideally put an object down that creates a ripple of the water hitting the cliff. But there's another tutorial to show how to do that, so I'll let you look at that one if you want to do that. In the meantime, we'll just have the basic one on, and I've lowered the wave height down to 20, and that should be probably fine. We'll see. If it's too much in the render, then we can reduce it. Just checking these other ones. Martin Blue, that's good. These are all fine. And the sky high, yep. Okay, I think that's all good. Right, so I'm just going to save that. And then the next thing I'm going to do is bring in the moss. So over here in the moss asset, we're going to be using top right, because this is the top right section. If you have any questions about which section is which, you can at any time just, let's go to this, select the geometry, the rock geometry that is, and you can see it's called rock 3 top right. So we're going to match that, and we're going to bring in moss 3 top right. If I've got this right, I believe what we do is we're going to import it into Maya 2017, like that. Okay. Hopefully that is working. Did that work? Yes, it did. Wow, it was quicker than I thought. Okay, so here it is. I'm going to now file this. Let's see. Let's drop it into environment. There we go. Note that there's this thing here which has actually come from the updated wave rig. It says do not move, so just don't move it, leave it where it is, that's fine. But we're going to focus on the moss now for this tutorial. Okay, so basically what I want to do is try and show you what this moss looks like. We're going to moss uses the mesh editor, so we've gone to mesh and then brought up the mesh editor. Now there's a variety of things that are using mesh in here, the reeds, the grass, the moss, all that kind of stuff. If you want to speed things up, a couple of things you can do. Actually, one of the things we could do, for example, is turn off the boss deformer. We just kill that for the time being. We can turn it on later by just ticking that box, so I'm going to leave that off for now. And then let's see, I can speed the scene up by turning off all these extras. So you notice I turned off grass and dead reeds because we'll need them later. But what we do want to do is we're going to turn on these things in a moment. Now this is actually, let me try and show you something so you can see what I'm doing. Yeah, okay, let's turn them on. But it starts to slow down the scene once these are on, so bear that in mind. Turn this on, please. Right, you can see the moss. Now it's actually lots and lots of tiny little reproduced small things that are reproduced many times by the mesh editor. And what you can see here is just those things being drawn. I'm going to isolate only this, and I'm going to turn on some geometry that wants to stay hidden, but for the time being, for your purposes, I will show it to you so you can see what it is. Show that, and polygons. There we go. So there's essentially a duplicated piece of geometry sitting in the scene attached to actually the reason I'm going to show you geometry instead is because it's quicker than having the moss on. But you could see where the moss was sitting on the rock, and I'm just going to turn this off to speed things up. Okay, right, now I've got a bit more performance. Alright, so now that moss will hug this piece of rock perfectly, but this piece of rock is not the same piece of rock that you see in the original scene. It's actually a custom piece of rock that will be hidden. It's custom geometry that will be hidden, and it follows the path of some joints, and those joints we need to constrain to the joint in the main rig. So let me show you what I'm talking about. I can turn off all the polygons now. I'm going to turn off the isolate select, and let's see, go to environment rock. Yeah, in actual fact we're pretty lucky in this scene in that the joints that are inside the rock set are in exactly the same position as the joints that are in the moss that I brought in. If there's no movement at all, I won't have to do anything. Let me just check though. I want to go to these controls and make sure that there's no movement on the rock set at all. And there isn't, so we're all good. That's it. But what I would have done if I had found that there was any movement on the set, if it moved around in any way, I was going to constrain the joints in the moss asset onto the rock asset, and that's pretty straightforward. It's a copied skeleton, it's identical. All you would need to do is select the joints here and parent constraint and scale constraint them, and then the same for the joints below that. So let me just show you. I think it's basically 4 joints. That one, that one, that one, and that one. And you just constrain them to exactly the same joints in the rock set. That way you know that the moss is going to follow everything perfectly. And that's it then. Because this scene doesn't have any movement, I'm not going to bother to do that. I'm going to just leave it as is and show you the rest of the scene. Okay, so now if you turn on locators, you're going to see these volumes, these big spheres, and they are actually represented by a controller. I tell you what, we can turn off those locators, but remember where they're placed, and we can now just look at this control here. I'm going to turn off the set controls. I'd love to get rid of the wave controls as well, so I'm going to just drop those wave controls into a display layer so they're not in the way. There we go. Do we have waves in here somewhere? Yes, I'm going to drop that next to that. Alright, don't need to see the joints anymore, so now I'm focused entirely on this controller here. And what this does is it moves an influence object around that defines where the moss is seen. So if I bring up the polygons, you can't see anything right now because I've got all the moss turned off, but essentially there's a sphere within this circle that represents a hotspot of where the moss is. By default it's placed in the middle, which for a scene like this is probably perfectly adequate, but let's say I wanted the moss to grow from here over to here. I might move the controller here and then animate it over to here. And the other thing you can do on this is you can scale it, and it's like a hotspot, so that the very center of the circle is going to be fully grown, and the outer edges of the circle are not grown at all. So if you scale this circle, you're going to get just a little spot of moss right there, and if you scale it back up, you're going to cover the rock. You got the idea? So as long as you grow, I think it's to within about, if this is the halfway point, then 3/4 points. Like these 3/4 points here and here, if you're within that area, you're pretty much 100% grown. But from here out to the edges, you're dropping away down to nothing. So you can move it around and you can scale it to define how the moss grows. And then when you actually want to see it, you just turn on those 5 elements right here. One of the other things you want to bear in mind is you want to look at where your scene is in the context of the edit and make creative decisions about how much moss you want in the scene. Now this is the right hand side island, so at no point in the film until maybe the very end do we ever want to see a large quantity of moss here, because we're not trying to make this island out to be a beautiful haven of growing life. That's the left hand side rock. So what we're focused on here is something that's just a little bit sparse. Now we don't have a lot yet, so I'm just going to have to turn it on and start making judgments about how much we want to place in here. Immediately as soon as I do this, it slows things down, so bear that in mind. And I can look at the quantities I have over here to drop things down. Like, I vaguely remember myself dropping this down to a fairly significantly less amount of that. Now these each correspond to different types of moss. There's 5 different types in here. If I turn them all on, it's going to get a little bit slowed, but we need to see it for a moment here while we decide how much of it we're going to have. So you just saw me reduce the amount on low grass. Okay, I'm going to do the same over here. And basically I'm taking about it down to 1/5 of what it was originally for this scene, because I don't need it to be as lush as it was. These values here are probably a little bit closer to the values that we would want for much later in the film for this side of the rock or the other rock. There we go. Okay, now the other thing we can do here is obviously you can animate the controller growing and moving to represent growth, but one of the things we found was that in order to get it to go down to 0, if you have a scene where it actually goes down to 0 or starts at 0, then you have to flip these values, offset animation and random animation, just as you're approaching 0. What I mean by that is you may scale down your controller and then at the point where you'll notice that some of the things haven't completely disappeared, you're going to animate the offset animation down to 0 and the random animation from 0 up to 1. And that's just a way of making sure that there's absolutely nothing there once it's scaled down to 0. But in this situation, we don't need to do that. I'm actually going to leave it static because it's a pretty subtle scene, and I don't want the plant life to be distracting from the performances of the characters. But that's pretty much it. One of the things I'm going to do is I'm going to just going to turn. What I want to do is check on this. So something to be aware of with the moss is that it is so small and so close to the rock. You need to be sure that the displacement on the rock is about right in order that it doesn't pass through the moss or the moss leaves a gap. The worst one is when you see a gap. I think what we do is this. There's a displacement node on the rock somewhere. Oh, hang on, I have to make sure I've got the right shader network selected. Here we go. And this displacement node right here has some offset values on it. Okay, looks like we're fine here. So I've updated the rock, which means that the offsets have been set correctly. And this works for most situations. And I'm actually hoping that ladybird's foot placement on the rock are going to look a lot better than they did last time because of these offsets. It essentially puts most of the objects that are just touching the geometry in perfect contact with most of the displacement. It's not the same everywhere, I will admit, that because the displacement isn't the same everywhere, but on average it puts it pretty close, which means that hopefully if you now see anything that's just a little bit off, you can go and grab that object and lift or drop it to connect with it after you've done a test render. But basically these settings here seem to work quite well on all the rocks, and so it's been put into the new rock set. Should make things a lot better. Okay. Other than that, just to be smart, I'm going to turn these things off so that the next person that loads it doesn't experience a very, very slow computer. Also bear in mind that in order for those things to work, you'll need to make sure that you've synced all the latest assets. There's a folder for the moss. I'll show you where it is. And basically, if you right-click on the textures folder in moss and just sync to latest, you're going to get everything that you need associated with that. The other thing you can always do is you can just go over to the scene and hit advanced get dependencies, and theoretically it should check everything and pull it all in. So you may want to do that before you open the scene file. And that's that. There we go. Make sure to turn off the old moss. So there was one down here that's, I think it's, that's interesting. I don't actually see it here anyway. Or maybe that's the new moss. Yes, I think that's the new moss. There's an old moss right here, and you just want to make sure that that's not being shown, because by default that one looks like this. And it's been okay as a sort of proxy object up until this point, but as a rule of thumb, we don't need it anymore because we've got a better working moss that we can grow and do more things with now. So what I tend to do is I put the T on the right hand side of the display layer to tell myself later that I don't need it during a render, and then I just turned it off, and that's that. I think we're okay there. Wave controls, green, yep. Alright, so that's that. And I'm going to save this and hand it off. Thanks.